Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's episode, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine. So today, I wanted to have a brief discussion about a military domain in which the Russians now have near total dominance. And this is a very important aspect of this war, as that dominance, as that superiority, is steadily growing. It's talked about very little in the mainstream media, and it has become a major problem for the Ukrainian military, as it has become for the U.S. military. So at the beginning of the conflict, the Ukrainians were able to have a great deal of success in striking Russian forces, Russian ground forces, on the ground with the Turkish-made TB2 Bayraktar, firing MAML air-to-ground missiles armed with both heat and thermal barrack warheads. These Bayraktar drones caused a great deal of Russian casualties and losses, both at the front line and in the rear area as well, engaging even some of the most advanced Russian air defense systems at the beginning of the war. We also observed the United States and other Western European allies donate a variety of high-end, very expensive in some cases, kamikaze drones, such as the Switchblade. Up to 700 of these Switchblade drones were donated to the Ukrainians. And again, at the start of the conflict, these systems, such as the Switchblade, were fairly effective. Now, there has been some discussion about the size of the warhead on the Switchblade and its lack of lethality, its lack of destructive capability. But one of the other important reasons why the Switchblade, why the TB2 Bayraktar became ineffective, very little is talked about now in terms of the TB2 drone. Remember, the Ukrainians were putting out music videos about the effectiveness of the TB2 drone. And indeed it was. It is a very good system when you are, let's say, a tyrannical dictator controlling the former nation state of Ethiopia, and you want to kill armed civilians. Effective system. But when you start to face a near-peer enemy, or a peer that is quite literally beyond you in terms of technology, in terms of having the ability to spend more on its military capabilities, i.e. Russia, in terms of comparing and contrasting to Ukraine. The TB2 drone worked initially and then failed, as did the Switchblade. So why is that? Well, the domain that I'm talking about is electronic warfare. Right now, as we speak, the Russians have total control of the front line in terms of electronic warfare. The Ukrainians are unable to operate TB2 drones along the line of contact as we speak. They were able to do that at the beginning of the conflict. Now it is near impossible. Near impossible. The Switchblade. The Switchblade drone normally goes to a higher apogee, a higher elevation to operate, identify targets on the ground, and then dive bomb down and engage a ground target. As the Switchblade drone gains elevation, that is where it becomes susceptible to the overwhelming capability of Russian electronic warfare now present on the battlefield. The only real effective systems that the Ukrainians are able to operate in terms of drones are the smaller FPV drones that are used at very, very low altitude and not very far distance from the actual operator. Even surveillance drones for the Ukrainians is becoming much more difficult to operate. The Russians have recently been able to launch ground operations against Ukrainian forces in which they were able to surprise the Ukrainian military. That was not happening earlier in the campaign. Now, the United States is still able to provide surveillance via satellites, which are more difficult to block in terms of that surveillance capability by the Russian electronic warfare capability. So the Ukrainians still have near total sensory capability over the battlefield. But the use of many of these fairly lethal weapon systems, particularly the TB2 drone, have been made essentially irrelevant. The electronic warfare is so dense that they can no longer operate those systems. Now I have to wonder what is next. The Russians are aware that the U.S. is providing a lot of real-time information. Real-time information about the battlefield, what is happening. And I have to wonder, again, what is next in terms of that capability to block that capability that is now being given to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have openly stated that they are losing about 10,000, up to 10,000 drones a month. And a large part of that is because of that electronic warfare capability. Now, are the Ukrainians deploying electronic warfare systems? Yes, they are. But the Russians are a step ahead. The Russians are even a step ahead of the U.S. in terms of some of these systems that are being deployed. The Russians, and obviously prior to that, the Soviets had invested heavily into electronic warfare, more so than the United States. Electronic warfare for the United States was more or less an Air Force domain. And they weren't normally used in large-scale ground operations. And therein lies the problem for the Ukrainians, is the Russian Air Force is very much active. The Ukrainians are having tough challenges in terms of deploying what little remains of its Air Force. So that's where we set for today, a brief discussion about that issue. It is a issue that is omnipresent, that is, again, not being talked about much by the mainstream media. It's not being discussed. But it is a huge problem, a massive problem for the Ukrainians and even the United States. Because it's a capability that the Russians have, and to some extent, the U.S. does not. That compounding with the uptick in the use of these Russian GLONASS glide bombs could change this war in a very, very tough way for the Ukrainians, especially the glide bombs that we're now seeing being used in ever increasing numbers. So that's it for today. More to come very, very soon. As always, thanks for joining us. Have a good day.